Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our pre-debate interviews. I'm here with Bob Kagan, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute, one of America's most influential writers and commentators on foreign policy. Bob, you're arguing for this motion, be it resolved, Barack Obama has emboldened our enemies and made the world a more dangerous place. Well, you're a student of history as well as of policy. What is it about this particular president, as compared to other recent incumbents of this office, that you think has harmed or hurt America's standing on the world stage?
Well, I think he brings up what you'd have to call a post-Cold War, but even a post sort of World War II mindset to international relations for the United States. I mean, the United States basically picked up this role as global leader after World War II, and it really persisted for the next 70 years. I would say he's the first American president who's not sure that he buys that concept. So to me, he reminds me much more of presidents of the 1920s, like Harding or Coolidge, the post-World War I presidents who sort of had the same response to World War I that Barack Obama had to the Iraq War, and it was like, no more of that. Mm-hmm. And they pulled the United States back. And I think that is, that's what President Obama has wanted to do. It's not easy to do once you're taking control of a country like the United States. But I think to the degree to which he has signaled, both to the American people and to the world, that he would like to sort of pare back the American role, that unfortunately in the international system where we live creates all kinds of problems, including making allies uncertain and giving potential aggressors the feeling that they might be able to get away with it.
And how would you respond to those who would say, look, the world's a much more crowded place than it was after World War II, the rise of China, America's power has declined relative to other incumbents that are now in the field. Isn't Obama simply acknowledging the times, the direction, the drift of global geopolitics?
No, I don't actually accept the notion that America is really even in relative decline compared to the past. I mean, really, if you go back to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union occupied half of Europe and had a massive nuclear arsenal aimed at the United States, and there was communist China under Mao or some of his successors, I don't envy that period. I think we're actually, in theory, better off than we were then. Whatever difficulties China poses, China has its own difficulties. Russia is, one of those countries that can cause a lot of trouble, but nobody thinks the future belongs to Russia. So I think the United States has the capacity to continue shaping the international system. Not perfectly, not with omnipotence, but of course, it was never omnipotent. We never were able to do anything we wanted to do. It was always a struggle. And I think it's an unwillingness to undertake that struggle that has characterized recent years. And by the way, not just President Obama, he's reflecting to a large extent the public mood. I mean, I think the American people have definitely gotten weary of playing this role, especially after the economic recession, but he's also encouraged it. There's been a kind of feedback loop between Obama and the American people, which has encouraged this mood. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that the American people now have a very low opinion of President Obama's foreign policy, as low as George Bush in 2006. So my theory is the American people may have wanted this, but they're not grateful to him for giving it to them.
Mm-hmm. You talk about the weariness of the American people. A more active America in the world probably means an America more willing to intervene, more willing to use military force, more willing to consider boots on the ground. Is that in the American mindset at all? I mean, and therefore you say Obama is a feedback loop, a great analogy, but is it right to criticize him for being in that loop when it is so pervasive, when it is so powerful?
First of all, I think the American people have been known to change their minds, and if you look at recent polls, it's interesting. He's gotten tremendous support for the use of force back in the Middle East. We've sent troops back into Iraq. The American people are supportive of that. There is this thing, and I don't mean to be trite. There is this thing called leadership, and it reminds me of the dilemma that Franklin Roosevelt faced in the 1930s. He faced a much more isolationist country and public mood than in the United States than President Obama does, And at first, he was just going along with it. He wasn't going to challenge it. But as the risks and the dangers in the world increased, he did his best to sort of gradually try to educate the American people and bring them around. I would say just in the nick of time. And of course, without Pearl Harbor, who knows what would have happened. But it is a president's job sometimes to push against the prevailing winds. If the American people are too activist, sometimes you have to restrain them. If they're too in a passive mood, sometimes you have to push them a little bit. And as I say, Obama was more inclined just to go along with it. Look, he didn't think he was elected to do foreign policy. He thought he was elected to do some domestic things. But unfortunately, as always happens to American presidents, foreign policies come to him, whether he's happy about it or not.
Well, let's talk about one of those foreign policy headaches, ISIS.
Yeah.
Do you think the response has been adequate? He has intervened. It's not boots on the ground, but it's, I guess, a policy of containment backed up by significant air power.
Well, I must say that, from the very beginning, even sitting military officials, including the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others whom Obama has appointed, have been warning that air power alone, without having at least trainers and advisors from the United States on the ground with the forces to call in airstrikes, to help them make the right decisions, are not going to be successful. And as of now, I think those airstrikes have not really been successful, even in terms of containment. The Yazidi who we rescued apparently are now back up on the mountain and facing the same problem that they faced before. There's been no progress in Syria at all. What I fear is that President Obama has sort of done enough to sort of make people think he's doing something, but not necessarily enough actually to succeed, and the price of that will be yet another military effort that didn't succeed. And I think that would be a very unfortunate, it would reinforce the American people's sense that we just can't do anything anymore, which has become pretty common in the American public's mind.
And what do you think about people who would posit that, look, the threats are very different now than they have been in the past? They're sub-state actors, they're asymmetrical, they're beyond borders, climate change. And Obama has tried to incorporate an understanding of these bigger 21st century threats into his diplomatic and kind of military toolkit in his approach to foreign policy. I mean, do you think he's put too much emphasis on that? Is he getting it right? Where do you come down on that?
Well, I mean, there's always something new that's happening in the world, and these things are new. I would say climate change is definitely a new challenge. I don't think we've addressed it very successfully. I don't see a lot of progress in the international system, agreement between the United States and China and Europe and India on how exactly to proceed. But yes, he's been addressing it. As far as sub-state actors are concerned, I mean, the particular sub-state actor known as terrorism has been with us for quite a while, and I would say it's reached a new level in a way. I mean, we've always had, for a while at least, we've had groups operating within countries. We now have a group that's threatening to become a country if ISIS is able to sort of carve out this caliphate that they're seeking. So I think that is new, and it's not going well. But there are also some very traditional geopolitical problems that have reemerged after sort of being quiescent for a while. We've seen major geopolitical fault lines. Obviously, Russia and Europe in that corridor running from the Balts through Ukraine to Georgia, that is now contested territory. And we've already seen a very sort of 20th century response by Vladimir Putin in terms he couldn't do it economically, he couldn't do it politically, so he just sent in the troops. We've seen that before. And then, of course, in East Asia, we see a similar fault line, which China is certainly a regionally rising power, wants to extend its influence, as other powers traditionally have done. Go back to Japan in the 1920s, not to mention the 1930s. And that fault line now is between China and Japan on one side, between China and India on the other. And so these are the kinds of geopolitical problems which I worry. These are the kinds of things that really change the international order. It's when the great power conflicts begin to arise that things really start changing in ways that become out of our control. And that's what I'd like to try to get under control in the coming decade or so.
Final question. What do you think this president's going to be remembered for in terms of his foreign policy, his actions on the world stage?
that's a very good question, and believe it or not, with 2 years left to go, who knows? And I'll only say I don't want to duck the question, but if you had asked how Ronald Reagan was going to look in 1987 at the height of the Iran-Contra affair, everybody said, "Oh, forget it. This guy's got the worst." After that, he negotiated the INF treaty with Russia. The Soviet Union collapsed 2 years later, and everything looked different. So I'm a little hesitant. 2 years is a long time. But look, I would say that what I would say he may be remembered for is shifting the pendulum too far. Yes, after George Bush's 2 terms, there was going to be a corrective. There probably needed to be a corrective. But did he take the corrective too far in the other direction? And instead of coming up with a kind of, intelligent but persistent American engagement, a willingness to use force when necessary, but in an intelligent way, did we go all the way over to, as he says, nation building at home, not active involvement abroad? That's one possibility.
Okay. Robert Kagan, look forward to the debate tonight. Thank you for coming to Toronto.
Thank you.
Great.
Enjoy it.